Welcome to the Mycelium Signal podcast. As always, I'm your host, Konstantin Tuonihovi. Today, our returning guest is a true visionary of occult black metal, Naas Alcameth. He hails from the United States and is a renowned multi-instrumentalist and a vocalist known for his work with Akhlys, Aoratos, Bestia Arcana, and Nightbringer. And a note to our listeners, please listen to Naas' previous episode for background context before embarking on this one. So, Naas, welcome back to Finland. It's quite mild weather here at the moment after a scorching couple of weeks. How are things over there?
Things are well enough here. It's also incredibly hot where I'm at up in the mountains in Colorado. So this last week has had it's been sweltering basically. So
it really messes up with your brain chemistry. At least I have found in Finland, and I'm not a fan of that kind of a scorching heat.
Yeah, same. I'm not a big fan of the heat, so I much would prefer the cold over the heat. So it doesn't typically get too warm up where I'm at because of the high elevation in the Rocky Mountains, but it's pretty hot out lately the last couple of days.
Yeah, it was the same in Finland too. But you're about to release Akhlys' fourth album, House of the Black Geminus, and congratulations on the hard work. I reckon you're quite relieved now that it's finally finished. How many hours do you think you have put it in total for this album?
Oh, that would be hard to say, hard to count. I started the entire process from start to finish was about 2 years, just short of 2 years. Now, of course, I wasn't working on it continually through that 2 years. It was off and on as, inspiration would strike and I'd get rolling for a couple weeks at a time and then, maybe finish a song and then struggle to, figure out where I was going from there and what the next composition would be. And certain compositions within the album proved very challenging and took quite some time, while others seemed to just happen like lightning flashes. So it was kind of this off and on process throughout nearly 2 years. And of course, it's you're going through the mental process of that too. So yeah, it is. By the time that you finish it is a relief, but then it's also kind of a head fuck because you've been at the middle of it for so long that it's hard to evaluate it. And so then you just at some point you just kind of let go of that, and at a certain point what we refer to as the muse takes over anyhow, and it's like you're no longer in control of it so much as it becomes its own thing, which is always a good sign. And then you just have to kind of relinquish to that and let it go into the world.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar with me and my work at the pit, and it's like a very interesting and phenomenon when the daimon muse actually takes hold. It's not autopilot in a bad way, but you really have to give it your control, so to speak, and the miracles do happen. But we can go more into that topic a bit later in this interview, but very interesting topic. Now, without further delay, let's dive straight into the deep end, shall we?
Okay.
I have listened to the upcoming album for maybe like at least 10 to 15 times. Basically, I think we could go into the new album first, and as it's pertinent to the themes we are about to discuss tonight. And I must admit that when I first heard about the album's concept, I was very intrigued and maybe even a bit surprised, and I'll explain later why. What is the concept of the album about in your own words?
So House of the Black Geminus is based on the concept of the house, and more, I guess you could say the symbol of the house, and that symbol or archetype as it relates to dreams. And so that's kind of the heart of it all. And that house, so where I was coming with this one was after contemplating it for a while, the house is a reoccurring symbol, and I don't think just for me, in general, for most people likely, And I think it has a lot of significance. It tends to act as not only like a location and setting for the dream narrative, but also seems to be have like its own spirit or anima or whatever you want to dub it, and then starts acting in many cases as sort of a presiding spirit over the dream. And in the connotation of the ecstatic dream or the nightmare, which is what's mainly concerned with Akhlys, it tends to be not just an abode, but an abode of darkness and trial, you could say. So I started thinking about this for some time, and I started really liking the idea of this house, and then putting more nuance on it, more focus on what that darkness is, what that trial is. And for me, it's often a confrontation with, what we dub the other. And specifically in this case, it would be a projection of your shadow self. And so your own daemon, your dark daemon. And many of my dreams reflect this. And in many of my dreams, I'm inside of some kind of house, and often it's supposed to have the connotation of it being my house or a previous house or a house I grew up in. I think most people are pretty familiar with, like, the uncanny nature of dreams is a lot of times you have these connotations, but upon recollecting the dream, you're like, well, my house didn't look like that, or there's differences, but it doesn't matter. In the moment of the dream, it is your house. Often it's very vacant, but not always. And there is typically, in these type of dreams, there's typically a presence. And that presence is, of course, unseen. And it's sort of radiating this dreadful aura. And so, typical to these type of nightmares. So I was thinking about this and the movement through the house in these dreams. And usually this involves wandering through dark hallways or passageways. Oftentimes there's a descent. And so I started ruminating over these symbols within these types of dreams within the house. And then I decided that I would structure it, give it a hierarchy that was very traditional. So you have 3 levels. And the first level where it would begin would be the middle level. So this would be akin to the 3 cosmic levels that you would find throughout various religions and mythologies. So you have the middle level that's where people would preside. And now in the context of the house, so you have two basically reflecting symbols here. So in the context of the house, this would be the place where the hearth is, and so this is where, again, families would preside. Also, where rites would be done. The hearth has a important connection to rites, especially ancestral rites and rites of the dead. So that is the first level within the album. And how I set this up is basically as acts. So Act 1 is the hearth middle level, which each act is comprised of two songs. From there, the movement goes into the cellar. And so the cellar in this structure of the house would be seen as the underworld. And then this is where the confrontation really occurs with the other. And then lastly, you have the highest level, which is within the symbol of the house, is the attic, which symbolizes the Imperium or the celestial. And so, but all of this, so you have these 3 levels, but all of it is still contained within the realm of dreams, which is kind of interesting because the realm of dreams itself also has a strong connotation with the underworld and the dead. So basically, it's a very Dante-esque structure and narrative of, and you see this again in Dante. The traveling into the underworld, and then of course they have purgatory, and then into heaven. But there's a lot of resonance with that same kind of archetype of that journey and that trial. We could also relate this to alchemy within the process, the movement, of course, with the nigredo, rubido, albedo. And so there's a lot of different things that we can relate it to. And so I became obsessed with this idea, and that's basically what informed the concept of the album entire.
Okay, thank you. That was a very precise introduction to the concept. Actually, I found this concept very fascinating because I have had recurring dreams about shadow houses, most often cottages that embodies the mysterium tremendum and fascinant aspects of the Numinous. And I can share some characteristics of these dreams later, but let's explore the album's tracks in chronological order. First is the Mask of Night Speaking. In your interview with Bardo Methodology, you said something along the lines of, you're making your way into the house and you're about to don the aforementioned mask. Can you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, so this one... this might be, it's harder to articulate, but I'll do the best I can here.
Yes.
So in these dreams, especially these nightmares, I always feel that there's this aspect of dread, of course, and as that dread increases and sort of washes over you in the dream, I always feel like there's like a double aspect within myself, and you have what you could maybe dub the dayside aspect with the dayside logic, that is being terrified and oppressed by this presence, by the dread. And so that sort of recedes, but then at the same time, another more hidden aspect becomes maybe more ecstatic and maniacal, and so in a very Dionysian sort of way, almost like akin to like maybe like a closing in on like a possession, like something is coming out that's usually hidden and taking over, and it usually feels very wild and sinister and lawless. And as this aspect rises, I think that is the precursor to the inevitable encounter with the other. And so, poetically speaking, I am now putting on that mask that will allow a dialogue that is beyond discursive, that has nothing to do with what we consider logic, but again, the dayside logic. We're in the realm of dreams. As anyone knows, that dreams, this logic does not really apply so much. It's almost a skew or a different category of logic and dialogue altogether. And so this is what I'm getting at with the adorning of the mask of night speaking. You're taking on a maniacal face, that the inner demonic face is now what you're wearing, and this enables you to enter into that uncanny dialogue. So therefore the night speaking.
Oh, I get it. I really do. I must interject here. Now that I have listened to the new album for quite many times in the span of less than a week, I have been in a steady diet of this new album. And once, I believe it was a couple of days ago at night when I was trying to get sleep, I was not drunk, but I had a couple of drinks, and drinking alcohol really messes up with your REM sleep. And I was on this pin cushion mattress, this kind of like a yogic mattress. So I think this kind of mild inconvenience really helps to get in some kind of hypnagogic state, as you very well know. And while I was listening to the album, I was not yet familiar with the tracks that well, but then I really understood the album's concept. It really clicked, because I had heard the two singles, the Sister Silence, Brother Sleep, and Maze of Phobetor before, and I have listened to those songs like many, many, many times. So basically, what happened was that I started to hear these kind of subtle nuances I couldn't hear before when listening to the album at a car or through a speaker. And I was in a total immersion with the album. And then it really felt very cinematic. And when the track, which we are going to discuss in depth, this Through the Abyssal Door started, I really felt I'm levitating to somewhere. I was almost having like a mild out-of-body experience or something akin to that. And I started to get these cold waves through my body. And I had those before since the last 3 to 4 years now. They're like a new phenomenon for me, this kind of level of cold shivers. And I always think that when I'm getting those, I'm really connected to something daimonic. And when I finally woke up in the morning, I listened to the album again because I wanted to hear that if I was hallucinating in the hypnagogic state, because that really happens. It's a kind of natural hallucinations without psychedelics, mind you. And I think I noticed most of the stuff in the morning in a kind of a more logical sense, but it really was a very unique experience. I don't think I have had with only like a couple of albums in my lifetime. So that's really a kudos thing. So I wanted to ask you, did you use some kind of ambient coast-like veils in the track? Because I started to notice all kinds of nuances in the first track, the Mask of Night Speaking.
Yeah, there's quite a bit going on the ambient side, which I've always done with Akhlys. So there's in some of this, when I'm composing this, it's more at the forefront. It's less subtle, but the more layering you do with the synthesizer, by the time you get to the mixing process and your studio engineer is balancing everything out, things will shift, especially stuff as subtle as some of these ambient voices. Some of them will nearly disappear entirely or shift in order from front to back. But I think that there's almost like an alchemical beauty in that, and you give up that control and just kind of have faith in it. And it's really interesting when you have someone like yourself, like an astute listener, who notices these things. And I think that it also can make the tracks and the album entire a bit protean, because the more you listen to it, the more it changes and you'll notice different things. I have seen some counter reactions to that. I did see some, just interesting to note. You'll have comments like, my God, what is that hissing noise throughout? Like the studio producer must have really fucked that one up or something. And I'm thinking that's intentional. That's an ambient layer, like you didn't listen closely enough, or perhaps this just isn't for you. But yeah, so there's a lot of that going on. And I like to have this kind of pandemonium within it, even if it's subtle and underneath the riffs, where it's constantly changing and rising and falling.
Yes, I noticed many subtle nuances on Aoratos, Gods Without a Name album, which was really difficult to first get into. But when I finally did, it was like a treasure trove of weird effects and wailings. And at one point, I understood that there was this female banshee-like wail throughout the album. And later, I only understood from your interview, those vocals were by Tonia, the new
Yes, correct.
artist.
Yeah. We basically gave her free reign, and she just kind of did her banshee wails and demonic screams throughout, and we just let that roll from start to finish, and worked out beautifully.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate these layers and this alchemical style. That I think this is something that most bands, I would believe, wouldn't bother to do, because they are not obviously obsessed by their diamond, And I really appreciate that when somebody goes the extra mile and does this kind of stuff that most people don't probably even notice, but it really adds to the albums.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes it maybe confounds our studio producer, Dave Otero, but I think he's so used to it now that, there's so much layering the keyboards going on, and, he's, like, what the fuck, man? Like, which one are we focusing on here? And I'm just kind of like, man, just doesn't matter. Let it roll. And once it, sounds like where it needs to be, then that's how it is. And there's even parts when I go into my original Cubase file that I even forgot about. I'm like, oh fuck, I forgot that was even there,
Yeah.
And I like that about it. I like that it has that depth, and again, that kind of pandemonium going on where these different aspects and faces are rising and falling in the background. And again, it's something that most people aren't, or they'll notice it maybe subconsciously, or they'll notice it just, kind of in passing, unless they really are listening to it many times and really, looking for that.
Yes, I think it demands a lot from the listener, and I'm happy to do the work. Actually, one thing which I think Clive Barker himself said, that sometimes you just have to trust your own madness.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. That definitely applies here, and through the years, especially compositions, I've gone to both extremes. With Nightbringer, there was a point where I was getting very, very focused on, like, I guess what you could call like a clean compositions, and really spending a lot of time with like tablature and stuff like that, and going, no, that note doesn't work with that. And instead of just kind of, which I've stepped back from somewhat now, saying, as long as the spirit is coming through, then there really are no rules per se. And, you always want a balance of technical know-how and then balance that with intuition and then overall spirit or vibe. But I do like to kind of let that the latter overshadow the former. So the composition, of course, always has to be interesting and tight and on point. But then let the chaos, leave that room for the chaos at the heart of it, and let that start to maybe even overwhelm at some point.
Yeah, it's like let the beast breathe,
Exactly. So you're really looking at kind of an order versus chaos thing. If we went too far in one direction, it would maybe just be nonsense, or just, or maybe it'd be interesting. Maybe it'd just be total cacophony with no structure or rhyme or reason. There's plenty of artists that do take that approach that I appreciate. But with this, I do like the tension between the two.
Yes, it has this element of danger, walking the tightrope or something like that.
Exactly. And then keeping in mind that the other is central here. And so, again, the other is something that we cannot fathom. We cannot articulate through, any of our dialectics. And so I want that element to appear in the music. And there's ways you can do that. I mean, even still structurally, which is almost seems like a paradox. There's ways to go about that, especially with stuff like unique time signatures and unique counts. A lot of it, we're still sticking to the 4/4 type structure, or maybe even like a 3/4. But then we'll get into stuff like 7/4, or these strange counts that I've, through experimentation, I found really start to give off this vibe of this, this uncanniness, this, I don't know, this waywardness that feels like it is other, starts to feel otherworldly. And it's a difficult thing to do. I think that you saw a lot of this starting to appear around early 2000, especially with bands like Decibel Omega,
Yes.
who were breaking the modern rock and roll metal structures, especially with timing and dissonance and stuff like that. But it's a tricky thing to do, because I've seen other bands that have just taken the same approach and done it in broad strokes, and that can quickly just end up sounding weird or obtuse for the sake of being weird and obtuse. And then I go, yeah, that's very, unique, I suppose, and very dissonant, but it doesn't relay a spirit sometimes. And sometimes you listen to these compositions and you're like, it just sounds weird. It doesn't really invoke anything. And so it's a subtle art, I think. And, praise to bands like Decibel Omega, who pioneered a lot of that, who understood that the subtlety of it, that you never want strange for the sake of being strange at the forefront of what you're doing. You're really, what has to be at the forefront at all times is the atmosphere and the spirit.
Yes.
Now you can use these as tools to construct that.
I really agree. And it's an art form to take these kind of liberties with different structures, and somebody can do it and others cannot. But I'm glad that Akhlys has been able to pull this off, and it really shows on the albums. I don't remember many albums that I can listen almost endlessly, I'm that kind of listener that I burn through albums like butter or something, because I'm a heavy listener. But we can get into the next track, the Maze of Phobetor, which was the second single, and it's probably the most chaotic and starkest tracks of the album because of its theme. And there is a verse, Protean labyrinth of deadly shadows, I am the wanderer within Phobetor's halls. And you implied elsewhere that a failure to navigate this maze of Phobetor successfully might lead to something even worse than death, the obliteration of one's I or spiritual essence. This sounds uncannily familiar. I understand this aspect is drawn from your recurring dreams, right?
Yes, yeah, that is correct. So, imaginally, symbolically, and the what has appeared within the dreams themselves, again within the house, is what I had relayed before. Is that there is some presiding spirit of otherness that's has an aura of palpable dread, and you're approaching this, and so you're approaching this through, again, in the symbol of the house, through hallways, and which are very protean in dreams, because they will have an uncanny nature. Like, as you walk down a darkened hallway in a dream, it might extend each step you take, or it might go beyond the proportions of what the size of what the house should be logically. And so therefore I leveraged the archetype of the maze, of the labyrinth, because it is very labyrinthian. And yeah, it is like again, it is a trial. And so there is that test, and again, that tension. And within these dreams, I think that anybody that has had anything like sleep paralysis, night terrors, any of that, there's the dreadfulness of it isn't a worldly fear. I mean, some people do have, or they sum it up, maybe oversimplify it by, I had a fear I was going to die, but I believe it's much more than that. It's much more than you're fearing a physical bodily harm, or even just bodily terminus. It seems to imply something that's even beyond that, that's more dreadful. And I think that that's why it's been given such strong religious connotations, especially for people in orthodoxies, like connotations like damnation. They thought their soul was at stake here. They thought they were in threat of being possessed by demonic spirits, if we're looking at like a Christian or Catholic context here. So there's something more weighty than just simply it being perhaps fatal to the body. It seems like it might be fatal to something more essential to the body, like the soul, or whatever you want to dub it.
Definitely. I find this phenomenon familiar with my own dreams, and we can get to those a bit later. And just to browse through the tracks to get people a better idea of the album, we can go to the third track, which is Through the Abyssal Door, which is written by our mutual colleague, author and esotericist Richard Gavin, who has appeared twice on this podcast as well. I found this concept particularly fascinating, and can you please tell me more about it, your collaboration on this track and the concept behind it?
Sure. So, anybody familiar with any of the previous podcasts I've done? I've been good friends with Richard for some time now, and we have a very similar outlook, especially on the esoteric. And so I just felt it was fitting to have his contributions. And so, I had laid out the album concept for him, which really resonated with him. And then I had asked if he wanted to contribute lyrics for a track. And then this is the track we chose, which I thought was perfect for Richard. And I think he really just did it justice, and, it's almost uncanny how similar we view certain things. And the nature of Akhlys, and especially the nature of this album, I just felt like almost he was a twin voice in this, in a twin mind. So I really wanted to have him appear on it. And so that's what we did. And, I think that he did a beautiful job with it. And it's a very important track, especially in the progression through the concept of this sort of descent aspect in the album. And so, yeah, I think it was just brilliant how he approached it all.
Yeah, I think this is perhaps the most monumental track of the already monumental album. And it's weird how these things do happen in other people's streams too. I'm speaking of my own here. I think I saw a dream like a couple of years ago, maybe, which I was in some kind of like a medieval setting, and the streets were empty in this old town at night. And then there was this like a proper house door which I entered, and then I was in this hallway which had massive doors, like something you would find in a castle, and something was behind the doors. It was oozing unbelievable Numinous energy. It was crackling with power, and I kind of opened those doors. I had to go through them, and behind those doors were another set of doors, and behind that was kind of the source of the Numinous power. And it was like it's hard to explain, but it felt like being in a space which was totally packed with some kind of incorporeal entities. It was the pressure and the sheer some kind of sentient interaction and communication which wasn't of a pleasant kind. It was being bombarded by different thoughts or forms or whatever. It really felt like encountering or almost encountering the true Mysterium Tremendum. And I believe when I woke up, I was a bit shook. And even though I'm quite familiar with this kind of phenomenon and subject, but this was so powerful, unlike before. And I had to go because of my work to some kind of mundane shopping mall, and where everybody was doing their everyday thing, like being totally oblivious in a consumerist craze. And I had to sit down in a non-populated area of the shopping mall and just ponder and kind of process what the hell just happened last night. And I had to talk about this with my colleagues at the time to have some like a context. It's basically like if you would have almost been run over by a car and you are miraculously you survive without a scratch, and you get that kind of feeling of what the hell happened. That was fucking close.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring that up. That's been used by different occult authors as an example. Is these moments of, and I think even the car scenario of being hit by a car or something that just kind of snaps you out of it. But within that split nanosecond, it's like all of reality congeals suddenly. You're kind of cast out of yourself, maybe a state of abjection again, and through that you see quickly a wider picture, and it's more of a wider lens and quick view of reality. It's a much broader view, and then you realize how much we do not see when we do not have or are not within those nanosecond moments. And so that's interesting. But yeah, the dream itself is interesting too, just with the multiple doors. There's again, speaks of very strong traditional archetypes of levels, and you see these levels and passageways and phases again in ancient religion and mythology. It made me think of Ereshkigal as passing into the underworld, and it's you're passing through these, I guess you could say, multiple doors at that point, or these phases, or again back to Dante and the spheres of hell. Yes, yeah, exactly.
I think the next track, it's an ambient track called Black Geminus, and you mentioned it. It features no vocals because no words can sufficiently reflect the nature of the other. And when I heard about this, I thought it was very thoughtful and on point, and it really resonated with my own thinking as well. But for the listeners' sake, could you explain what you are exactly referring with this Black Geminus?
Well, at this point, so we're on the second track of the second act, which takes place in the cellar, so the underworld. So you've passed through, gone from the hearth down the labyrinth, the halls, and then passed through the Abyssal Door, which is almost the culmination. Passing through the Abyssal Door, it's penultimate, and then so with the ultimate encounter, I guess you could say, coming into direct contact with this presiding spirit of otherness, this is where the dread would rise to its heights in complete madness, ecstasis, so on. Very much a Dionysian frenzy, where you are filled with the spirit. And so again, I feel like these things are, it's goes beyond the discursive. It's non-discursive interaction, non-discursive dialogue, which again, is a paradox, but the paradox is exactly at the heart of it all. That is the signpost. And so that's when I decided, because at first when I was, I had the concept in mind overall, and I was creating the ambient track for this moment, and I was trying to think of what these lyrics should be, and then it just kind of, I kind of just had an epiphany. I was like, there shouldn't be any lyrics. This should be, on that front, on the front of a dialogue that we can understand, that can be interpreted into lyrics, it should be a resounding silence, because that resounding silence speaks more words than any words can when we are trying to relay such an idea.
Yes, exactly. I think throughout the album, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am, there is this kind of very interesting hum of electricity. It feels like the whole album, or most of it, is being close to some kind of nuclear reactor. You have like a imaginary chaser counter at your hand, and it's constantly crackling. I found this very powerful, and I hope I haven't hallucinated this aspect.
No, I think that you're spot on. I think, and it's funny because again, going back to just some of the comments I've seen, the negative comments are like, they've noticed, they've picked up on the same thing that you have, and they're like, what is this subtle hum throughout the album? This is annoying. Because they're looking for these are listeners that are, not maybe so much invested in these kind of things, and they just see it as a hum, and they're like, well, that shouldn't be there. And I think that really is on the purely logistical side, and the composition side, that was a result of the layering of all the ambient nuances that run from start to finish. But it was, I saw it as fortuitous that it kind of created exactly what you said. It's almost like an electrical current from beginning to end, and I think that it kind of bolsters this spirit of the album, and it is subtle. It is very subtle. So it's interesting that you noticed that.
I remember that you probably said this in Bardo, that there was some tracks where the sound was supposedly, seemingly like a breaking from the pressure, while it was technically not. And I think this element also, like these subtle changes in the sound waves. I'm not a musician myself, but I listen to so much music, so I pick up on these things. And I think I liken to this as some kind of the aforementioned element of danger, And if you have that in a black metal album, it's splendid. I mean, if it's in like an honest and very unique way, it's so much better, because I think most of the black metal and whatever metal albums kind of lack this very weird sense that the album is an experience and not just something that people have come up, in a studio. For example, I must compliment Vitriol's new album, and it really has the same element, that it's being, like Kyle Rasmussen himself said, that sonically waterboarded, and I really love it.
Absolutely. And that's, Kyle's a good friend of mine, and I love his approach. We come from different genres, slightly, but his approach to it, I just love, because he's so into breaking boundaries and experimenting. He's not trying to just be another American death metal band. He's really chasing concepts and trying to find unique ways to really strike at the heart of those concepts. And especially on the new album, man, that one just blew me the fuck away, because there's so many uncanny things I've never heard done by any other bands. And, that shows his tenacity in chasing these subtle and ungraspable things. And, he's very good at doing that. He's obviously an amazing and very technical player, and has an understanding for, brutality and violence. But he adds a whole nother level to all of this that, makes his compositions even all that more interesting, especially on his new album. Like that one is just, I have nothing but praise for it.
Yes, the Suffer and Become, which is the name of the album, was a very tough nut to crack. But from the start, I think I noticed that there is something very unique and like a word digging out in this album. And it took many, many listens to crack. And I think I have now kind of mastered the album with dozens and dozens of spins, I believe. And these kind of things are very rewarding. So we can get to the fifth track of the album, which is the first single, Sister Silence, Brother Sleep. It aligns with your vision, and you describe in Bardo Methodology magazine that you conceptualize two mythical entities carrying the dreamer upstairs to the attic. And this attic, seldom occupied liminal space, bathed in light, is envisioned as the locus of profound revelations. What happens then?
And so this is basically the end result of the I guess you could say, the breaking point, or like an endodromia from the tension from the cellar, from the encounter in the underworld, into the ecstatic bliss. And I don't want that resolve to be taken out of context. It's not like as Richard Gavin, I think, had put it, like a heavenly repose, but it is the revelation, the final revelation of Gnosis. And that's why, and so you're going to see some contradictory things, right? So now, very contradictory would be that we just went from the nadir all the way to the apex in a single movement, and that now we are leveraging the symbol of light instead of darkness. But that light is still a very, very dangerous light. It is pregnant with power. And when I imagined this, I not only imagined an attic. If you walk up into an old attic, a lot of times it has a window. And if you were to do this during midday, you'd probably have a lot of light coming through there. Now, if you picture a figure standing in front of that window, that figure would be a silhouette of absolute darkness. And so it's kind of a conjunction of the two. So now you are seeing the next revelation of your daemon, and so this is actually the if we talked about this building up in this culmination, this is the end point here, and the end point is that actual communion with your daemon of other.
Yes, I think that when I first heard the track, it was it released like a month ago or something, and I have listened to it numerous times. And it's weird that when I first listened to the song, I immediately noticed the electricity hum, which I liked very much. And I also did a technical review of the whole track before. But it was interesting that it features these weird passages with almost like if you are getting drunk on a very good wine. It was like mesmerizing. It had this sickly delight, being poisoned and being intoxicated at the same time in a good way. It's very hard to point, but it had this feature. And one point of the track, there is this triumphant, almost like a fanfare section, which was a bit of a surprise to me. And after that, it kind of descends back into hell. It was a weird experience. And when I listened to the whole album, it finally clicked. Some nuances that I couldn't just get it before hearing the whole album. And like you said somewhere else, that you need to listen to the album to understand the whole thing. So it really clicked, and I'm glad it did.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was maybe a strange one to premiere first. That was a real hard decision for me. We almost didn't premiere any. I was really starting to go in the direction of no premieres, because the album really properly to be understood should be listened to in order from beginning to end. Sister Silence, Brother Sleep specifically is maybe the odd one out on the album. It is probably has the most melodic parts interspersed with the chaotic parts, especially the opening, and then the end is maybe more a bit triumphant sounding and less so with the cacophony of chaos and dread. Although it has plenty of that still. I mean, it descends, like you said, it the way it starts, then suddenly it descends back into chaos and hell. And so, especially that opening riff is very triumphant and pretty melodic. And again, with the closing, and I think it threw a lot of people off, that being the first thing we premiered. I did see comments of concern of like, oh, this maybe sounds too much like Nightbringer, or this is maybe too much of a departure. And we were really hoping for these elements that Akhlys is known for that seem to be missing from this track. And again, it's like, well, this is one piece taken out of a greater whole. All that exists. And I think that song in particular shines when you've heard the whole thing and you have the whole context. And it's very strange, because this song seems to have the most division between people that like it and dislike it. People either love it or they seem to not like it at all, which is very interesting. But I think within the context of the whole of the greater album, that it definitely has its place. So you have to take it within context. And then, interestingly enough, when we followed that up with the second premiere with phobetor, I had seen comments from the same individuals who all of a sudden were like, oh, this is exactly what I was hoping for. So, it's hard to say. It's all in the mind of the beholder. There will be some people that are like, oh, I don't quite like that one so much, but I love this one, or vice versa. That's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. And I would just reiterate what I just said, that when people listen to the album as a whole, it really fucking clicks. Even the triumphant parts, which somebody wouldn't understand without the proper context. But I think that's the beauty of the concept album.
This track in particular was the most difficult track. This is the one that I sat on for the longest, that I struggled with the most, and mostly because I did start it off the way I started the track, with that very almost classical black metal opening triumphant riff, which I loved. It was one of the first riffs that I wrote for the album. At the time, I wasn't writing it for the album, though. This is before I decided to do the album. I had just moved up to where I reside now, pretty high up in the Rocky Mountains, and I think it was the first week I was here. We didn't have any furniture or anything, and I just came up with it, and I just loved that riff, and it came back to me later. And then the challenge was, well, where do I go from here? Because the tenor of that riff could easily lead into a whole lot of just more melodic riffs, and then that wouldn't be true to us. So I had to find clever ways to turn it back down into hell and back down into chaos, and then bring it back up from that to nod back to the opening. And so and it's not completely foreign to us. I mean, you can look at some of our other previous tracks that have very similar riffs, that have a very majestic and triumphant vibe to it. And so I don't think that we just totally went, out into left field on that one. But I did know when we premiered this, I was like, this will be interesting to see the reactions, because I was very hesitant to use this one as a premiere, because I was like, this, the problem with premieres is supposed to give you an insight into what the album's going to be. But with this album, I was like, I don't think any one of these tracks can possibly do that.
Yes, because it's really like a cinematic experience with different scenes, and like in a good movie. Final track of the album is Eye of the Daimon Eye, and you said that this is where the protagonist adorns the thousands upon thousands masks of self. Are you referring to some kind of alchemical crowning? And I think you are, because you already spoke about this, and I understand this album reflects an alchemical journey from Nightbringer to Albedo to Citinus and finally to Rubedo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the thousands upon thousand masks is because, we're speaking of things that at its essential core is eternal. And eternal becomes a paradox too, because it's outside of time, it's timeless. So the eternal is not, shouldn't be seen as the abundance of time. It is the heart of paradox. It is the absence of time, the destruction of time. And so there cannot be a resolution. There is no resolution ever. And so it's you remove one mask, there's another mask. So it is an endless process that speaks to eternity. And so that's kind of the idea on that one. And then again, I'm looking at this symbolically, this idea of reflection, like the idea of the mirror. And so now the eye is on both sides of the mirror. That's why it's Eye of the Daemon. The eye is what perceives, and perceiving one's own eye is again a paradox, but it is like the ultimate, the state of moving from becoming into being, but then reflected outwards eternally as just endless becomings. And so that's really what I was trying to get at with that track, and that's why the title is what it is, and how that title is formed.
Yes, I understand. I think the final track is like a good epitome for the whole cinematic experience, or at least in my own mind's eye, I kind of saw the whole album as a movie.
Yeah. It's very again, like you said, cinematic. The hardest part once I got to that track is I was pretty much exhausted on all levels, mentally, spiritually, physically, just done with the album. My one regret, I guess, on that song is it's not that I dislike the way that it ends. But I had, of course, hindsight's 2020. After everything was finalized, I was fucking around with it because there was something that wasn't sitting well with me. And then, of course, I come up with this amazing ending that I wish that I could have gone back and done, or I wish I would have thought of it at that time, because I just felt like it wasn't quite enough. But I always feel this way. I mean, this is very typical for me. So, I was like, damn it, I shouldn't have even fucked around with this, because now I'm like, I wish I could have put this right at the end, because I came up with something maybe a little more potent, or, but it's just the way it goes. It's the crux of being an artist. You can be pleased with an album, but I never feel like I'm 100% feel like I have captured the idea to sufficiently, but I don't know if that's exactly possible, and that's maybe not the point. I think that it's always like, it's like the carrot in front of the donkey. You have to keep going. But what would that even mean if you're like, I finally did it. This is perfection.
Yes, I think that would be even dangerous to the creative process to be fulfilled or like, pleased with something.
Yes, exactly. Because then you're done, right?
Yeah.
And it would be untrue because it can't be true because there is no such thing as a state of absolute perfection when it comes to art.
I truly agree. And now that we mentioned Nightbringer in the beginning briefly, we can delve deeper into this often frustrating ordeal. You mentioned elsewhere the following about Nightbringer phase. The muse speaks when it wants, how it wants, and then silence. And regarding this dreaded silence, you advised, and I found this particularly helpful to myself, when you are feeling perturbed, both mentally and physically, there's a tendency to shun everything related to the creative process. However, pushing yourself beyond comfort, even in a less than ideal frame of mind, can prove beneficial. Who knows what might emerge, especially if you're dealing with something as dark and adverse as black metal. Perhaps some lightning will strike. Where do you think these periods of inspirational or existential drought originate, aside from the absence of demonic influence?
Well, I think a key element to it is, well, there's a couple key elements, but a want, a desire, right? If the daemon speaks continually, you would probably be overloaded by it and overcome by it. Periods of silence, that's when you have to reify desire. And so that desire to reach this point, that desire is going to be rekindled in those moments of silence. You desire that dialogue again, and you have to earn it all over again. So and then that has to be bolstered by will. There's the axiom of will, desire, and belief, and I think that's very important. And it is, especially, it should be no surprise, me doing an album that's based on archetypes that speak to stuff like Dante, like that it's going to be a trial. If this is the heart of it, it's going to be a trial for me. And so, yeah, it is frustrating. And you do reach those moments where, you're trying to work on compositions and you just realize it's not great. You're like, this isn't great. It's okay. It's good. And then do you go forward with that? No, you have to cast it out. Do you want to cast it out? No, because you're fucking tired. Yes. You've been working on it for a long time, but you have to have dignity. You have to have enough dignity and self-awareness to say, this isn't good. Don't use it. It doesn't matter if it takes me another 6 months. And then, of course, there's a fear aspect. And that fear aspect is, what if I never get there? And you can't go off this idea of lightning does strike. And like I said, with some of the songs, inspiration struck and it just was compelled forward from beginning to end. Now that does happen sometimes. Sometimes it does not happen. Sometimes it happens through endless toil and work. And so instead of hoping that lightning strikes, you've got to trudge out into the field with a lightning rod and keep pointing it at the sky. And maybe it doesn't work, so you got to trudge higher onto a hill. Maybe that doesn't work, so now you got to climb a fucking mountain and just be in this absolute window of self-doubt and worry. And again, but this is creating the tension. That's the point. The tension is that's what the daemon likes. The daemon wants you to bleed for it. It requires suffering. It requires a sacrament and a sacrifice to it. And so if you are lucky enough for the daemon to speak in a lightning flash, and then that's your expectation moving forward, you're going to fail. You're going to fail. And I think that this is maybe the problem with, even outside of an esoteric context, just in general with bands that just kill it on a couple albums and then they just put it into autopilot and move forward and their albums become less interesting.
Yeah, they kind of lose the connection with this kind of contrasts. I think even though these Nightbringer phases, or because of them, one becomes more resilient and able to endure more. But do you think, and this is perhaps a weird question, but I have been pondering about this, do you think it's possible to eventually develop a long-lasting psychological or even neurological damage from this overloading of the system? I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, but I just as like a thought experiment. Do you think there would be some kind of adverse effects of being continuously used by Daimon in like a high level?
Well, that's a tricky question, but I think overall the answer would be yes. I think we have plenty of examples of both illuminated creative minds that aren't necessarily tied to the occult, but then certainly within occultists where they've had a mental break. I mean, you saw this with Crowley, and you saw this with, let's go outside of the esoteric circle, Edgar Allan Poe. You do have, if you reside within these realms long enough, there is certainly a danger. And maybe you progress and, you reach a higher level, but that danger doesn't decrease. It probably increases. So for example, a good example here is the Eastern Vamamarga. And, this is where we get our term, the left-hand path, from.
Yes.
Well, the issue with this practice, they called it the razor's path for a reason, because you're walking literally a razor's path, a very, very fine line that can cut you easily. And, supposedly these Mahasiddhas, many of them, if not most of them, probably fell off that path towards divinity and went into an opposite trajectory, basically through the practices that they were involved with, because they're so volatile, they are so dark. And now that's a very dramatic reference there, but you could even see this. I have really great conversations with my good friend and former bandmate Ophis, who's very intelligent and very well read and learned in esotericism. And we were just talking about one time just black metal in general, and just the things that have occurred in our lives and the chaos and, friends dying and all this shit. And you see this elsewhere, obviously. It's kind of, again, a hallmark of black metal. People dying, suicide, chaos, strife. When you make this your world, what else do you expect? You are living in the volatile. Yes. You are living in the darkness. You are living in the chaos. You are trying to cultivate those things. You're not just living there passively. Usually you're cultivating them and trying to take on, these very powerful things. And so it's part and parcel. It really is. Like, you can't be shocked by it when, moments in your life go to fucking shit, or people die, or really terrible things occur.
Yes, I have seen plenty of that too. This is something I actually had written in my notes to be discussed in a future section of this podcast, but we can discuss it now because you just brought it up. In Finland, we have this expression of burning the candle at both ends. Maybe it's like a universal one, but I think this is really the case, that it's a kind of alchemical process that you're sacrificing parts of yourself to the process as well. I find it interesting that throughout my life, I have taken many of weird paths which are non-conforming ones, and they have gotten me into all kinds of trouble. But I haven't felt that I have had the option, and I'm not complaining here. It's just something which has happened, and I'm reached this point when I'm 46 years old now, and I'm as independent in my magical and artistic work as ever before, because of these turns which have been quite painful at times. But I now understand why I had to choose those different paths.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that just speaks to, like you said, you had no choice.
Yes.
Saturnian souls, Saturnian or even, Uranian or Plutonian types. If that is your spiritual disposition, that is what it is. And you probably won't have a reprieve from trying to go the opposite direction because it'll be contrary to your spiritual disposition to begin with. So if you were born to the maelstrom, you were born to the maelstrom. You need to embrace that and navigate it as best you can. I mean, what else could you possibly do?
Yes.
Turn that lead into gold, do it the best way possible. But there's not going to be an indefinite reprieve from it. And if there was, then you probably failed in a greater sense. You probably failed. And then what do? What would that even look like? In this context, as like a musician, those are the guys that quit playing music and just finish out their lives, go into their 9-to-5 desk job and, doing mundane things and fucking die, and fuck that. So.
Yeah, definitely. It comes to my mind quote by Jung, but something I hadn't read before, and I included it for this podcast. It goes like this: the birth of the creative work has its counterpart, the descent, the catharsis, the healing and making whole, which is the work of salvation. This is the task of the artist, and one which calls for the hero's courage. To perform this difficult, often thankless task, an artist must be willing to pay the price which the daimon demands, the suffering and the turmoil, the sacrifice of personal happiness, and often the dark night of the soul. I think you really hit the nail on the head with this one, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, Jung is very much leveraging ancient traditions like Hermeticism, alchemy. And yeah, there is no true healing. There's not going to be any true healing without basically just descending into hell. It would be anything otherwise would be a retreat. And a retreat is an oppression in itself. And that is not true healing. And this is why the ancient Greeks, part of their healing process, especially with the entering into the dream world, which sometimes was done underneath temples of Apollo. And those temples of Apollo, the area underneath was connected with the underworld. It was in caves. And so, caves are a very important figure in the Greek world and elsewhere as far as a symbol of entrance into the underworld. But that's where they would heal. And so they have to go through an ordeal in order to heal themselves. I mentioned this on another podcast, which is more just kind of real world dayside. Something that's synonymous is they've been doing these studies with terminally ill patients that they just cannot mentally deal with the fact that they're going to die. So they live in a constant state of absolute anxiety, which you can imagine that's got to be hell, man. And yes. So what they're doing to treat them in these clinical studies is giving them hallucinogens and massive amounts of hallucinogens to the point that the point is the bad trip, but not just a bad trip, but like a monumental ego shattering journey through hallucinogens. And they do this with, psychologists on hand, therapists that walk them through this journey. And I love this when I watched this documentary on it. They said they gave them heroic doses. And in this case, it was psilocybin. And my immediate reaction is heroic doses of psilocybin does not sound fun. That doesn't sound like a party. And they actually have footage of this, and you could just see these individuals are absolutely on the cusp of ego dissolving and in an absolute state of just the ultimate dread and panic. And these people know it's one thing to take hallucinogens. Now imagine taking a hallucinogen, knowing that you're terminally ill and going to die soon. You know where your brain's going to go. You know where the focus is going to be.
Yes.
And they do this, and then it goes again, and this is, the enantodromia, that, again, a very Jungian term. It hits its breaking point, and it, almost rubber bands back in the opposite direction. And the realization when they come out of this is once they do hit that ego shattering moment, that ego death, is they realize that death isn't a thing. death has no context really in the greater scheme. And so they lose their fear of death. And it's really interesting because it's you don't see this much. You see modern psychology and modern science is now kind of, at least to a degree, paralleling stuff that the ancients knew that we would consider esoteric. And that's the result. That is the result is and I would be interested to see what the studies are on the ones it doesn't work on. Because again, it's not obviously any of these entrances into the underworld is not assured. I want to know about what percent doesn't make it through that journey, and they are more fucked.
Oh, damn! Jesus, that would be like really like an adverse effect, like a hellish one.
Yeah. And so that was a thought that I had. I was like, I wonder how far this study will make it before a certain amount of these people are so completely broken even before, they were entering into this. And at what point does someone pull their funding? Like, this guy's now just psychologically absolutely destroyed. He was pretty destroyed before, but now you guys gave him a bunch of fucking psilocybin and he's a raving madman now. I mean, I think it's a great fucking approach, and I'm all for it. But it just shows that there is no absolute fail-safe. There's no guarantee. With those individuals, it's going to come down to their will.
Yes, that is like the ultimate catabasis.
And then now it's not even a will to live, because we always phrase that term with the will to live. They know they're dead. They're just walking dead men, and so it's the will to what? The will to what? And I think that's what they discover, or they don't discover. And if they don't discover, then they're damned.
Yes, until they die, of course, but yet the final moments will be that much worse. It's quite uncanny and synchronous that I happened to listen to this audiobook by Merlin Sheldrake. It's about mushrooms, kind of cultural history of mushrooms, and it of course delves into the psychedelic mushrooms, the psilocybes too, and it actually had this very same thing you just said about the terminally ill patients and how they are encountering this death, and most of the cases have been beneficial. But it's interesting that you brought it up just today, because I heard it elsewhere in the book, and we actually touched upon this subject briefly in your last episode as well. But this is a very interesting topic.
Yeah, for sure. I at least hope the ones that aren't successful, that they give them a refund. Yeah. I guess that's the best you could do at that point. Yeah. So, sorry, it didn't work, man. Enjoy the rest of your days, your short days.
That will be quite difficult to do. We can return to the theme of the shadow houses. And I had one note. I think you would find this interesting, and our listeners too. And I cut right to the chase in the dream. Once inside in the shadow cottage, it seems to have been unoccupied for years, just like in your album. And I have had these dreams for years now, before even hearing about your album. And it has been unoccupied for years and even decades, and the air is stale and dusty. Sometimes there is a weird bluish spore-esque haze emanating from the surfaces. The atmosphere is unsettling, and I must usually descend to the lower floors of the cottage, which is a bit illogical. Sometimes the whole cottage is situated underground, and once I found a massive World War II era bunker, which I believe even my father wasn't aware of. Anyhow, these lower floors of the cottage are even older, and they, as you know, emit this extremely unnerving sense of an ominous presence. I do know that I'm alone there, but the dayside logic doesn't do much over there. Sometimes I gather that these levels descend multiple floors below, and deep down there's something incredibly unsettling. I think I likened over 20 years ago when these nightmares, probably caused by sleep paralysis back then, which I didn't know about, were at the most extreme that's where the so-called King Fear himself resides. So pretty fucking similar to your own experiences, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a powerful symbol. The downwards in the earth. I mean, even in a Christian context, the devil resides at the center of the earth. So yeah, that there's something about the symbol of descent that just resonates with that. And then you see it in almost every ancient religion. Same kind of concept. Ascent is related to one thing, descent is related to another, and has this inherent darkness and a threat eventually, again, not only of losing one's life, but losing one's ego, and then perhaps a perpetual dispersion, which is a very scary thought. You can relate that to also the symbol of the ocean. And then again, the symbol of the ocean is another symbol of depth. It's depth and darkness, or even the cosmos. H.P. Lovecraft leveraged that a lot. The vastness of the cosmos and the black between the stars, and these kind of things, because it's a place of dispersion. Is really what it is. And so I think that these archetypes are always going to rear their heads in these type of dreams, and they are sacred. It's not just purely psychological. They are sacred in the absolute term of itself. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting to think about.
Yes, it's we can go even further down. The very source of our mutual fascination, which is some kind of liminal thread. Now, you're one of the few individuals I know who have been ridden with childhood parasomnia, such as sleep paralysis. And I believe I had my own first experience of this kind when I was around 8 to 9 years old. And it was recurring for maybe a few years. And it really fucking shook me to my core. Could you recount your early, now infamous, the devil is coming out of me childhood experience?
So as far back as I can remember, I had very potent nightmares. Now, through analysis, through psychological analysis and otherwise, like, we know that these things they tend to be more prominent in youth, especially childhood, and then again tend to rear up again during teen years. And that definitely played true for me. Way before, as far back as I can remember, I would have these nightmares that I know now had that hallmark of absolute dread. And as a child, we could barely navigate these things as adults with armed with logic. But as a child, you don't have that. So you are probably a couple steps closer to the reality of it, because you do not have the armor or safeguard of adult logic, right? To gain any distance. It just is what it is. But I remember waking up as a small child, and I of course, so long ago, I don't remember the context of the dreams, but I remember just being so absolutely terrified. And of course, your parents are like, "Oh, my child has had a nightmare." It is what it is. But it was more than that. It was more than that. And as an adult now, I realize that I'm like, oh, we don't, we need to take this into consideration, that there is a certain category of dream experience that goes beyond just a regular nightmare, and that children are more susceptible to it. And so there's that. And so this ground was not unfamiliar to me leading up to the event that you had mentioned. And that one, so I've talked about it several times, but I'll reiterate it here. I think it was like 11 or 12 years old. I was still in elementary school. I knew that. So in elementary school, maybe I want to say 6th grade. And things to keep in mind, especially for people that might be on the other side. I don't just get lost to the most fantastical ideal right away. The most fantastical idea. I was sick. I did have the flu. So there's that. I was given, I believe, Robitussin. And what I recall from it was I was really sick. I was home from school, It was night. I was laying at the very foot of my parents' bed, and my dad was watching football. And so I'm just kind of like, zoned out, robotussined out as a little kid, sick as fuck. Not really watching, just kind of gazing through the TV. And then the next thing I remember is there's this little window. For some reason, I remember it. And now this would be in a sleep paralysis state. And I'm in my bedroom downstairs in the basement. My door is open, and I'm actually laying on my side, which is interesting because most sleep paralysis tends to occur while you're prone, but does sometimes occur otherwise. I'm laying on my right side. I'm gazing out through my open door, and that goes into like a living room, like a downstairs like area. And I'm looking directly at, my parents had a framed poster of the Olympics for whatever year. So this is, 90s, early 90s, late 80s. No, I guess it would be the early 90s at that point. And it's like a bicyclist. And that has no significance really. It's just where I was fixated. But I was just giving that hallmark overwhelming sense of dread into the state of objection, and just petrified by it. I mean, literally I was petrified because I think I was experiencing sleep paralysis. Then it goes from missing time to suddenly being upstairs in the upstairs living room at the house I grew up in, sitting on my dad's lap in total just panic. And my sister's there, and my mom's on the phone. And, what I remember from that was just a bunch of chaos. And then the paramedics arrived, and I went to the hospital. What was filled in those gaps was from like my parents and my sister. And apparently I came upstairs just wearing my shirt, no other clothes, and almost in like a somnambulistic state. Like they thought I was just, which I probably was, like sleepwalking. But my mom said I wasn't like breathing. And so she rushed me into the bathroom and like ran hot water in the bathtub, get like steam going. And then I didn't snap out of it. And then I apparently started acting really erratic and saying a bunch of things, cursing a lot, which at that age wasn't something I really did. To the point that they were like, okay, he's having a seizure. Like, our son's having a seizure. Get on the phone with 911. And so apparently my dad was holding me, and my sister was the one that told me the most, because my parents don't really like to discuss all that. But my sister was like, woke her up. She went upstairs, and she said at one point I like looked at her directly, and I was like, what are you looking at, you fucking bitch? And then she said I'd go back and forth between the state of like scared little boy saying, help me, help me, help me, into, swearing and doing the shit. I mean, it was, I mean, a little melodramatic, because it was like the shit I said was like almost, humorous, I guess. My mom at one point, or my dad said that my mom was on the phone with 911, and he was like, what's taking him so long? And I said something like, yeah, tell him to hurry the fuck up. Or I said something like that, along those lines.
Yeah.
But my sister said that the strangest part was, she's like, he kept looking up at the corner of the ceiling. She was like, he kept looking up at this corner. And then she was like, and then you said, the devil's coming out of me. And she said that's what stuck with her, into her adulthood. She was like, that scared the shit out of me. She's like, when you started saying the fucking devil's coming out of you. And so I use that, of course, me being me, I use that for lyrics. But yeah. So it's just interesting. And like I said, most of that I just relayed. I don't remember. I just got that, secondhand mostly from my sister. But I do remember, the one thing I told my sister I do remember is going home that night, my parents' old 1978 Toyota Corolla laying down in the back when they were taking me home from the hospital. And I was, in and out of slumber. And I remember my dad saying to my mom, that was like something straight out of The Exorcist. And that always stuck with me.
Yes, I think when you hear about other people's recounts of the thing, it really like it makes it more cinematic and dramatic and interesting, you know.
Sure. And I think that this is why in my teen years, my mom had a very adverse reaction to what I was into. And now in hindsight, I'm like, now I can kind of understand why, you know. I mean, she probably just would have anyway. But I wonder if that's a part of it. Is you know, most teens went through this kind of shit. Like once she realized what I was into, she threw away all my music, and I had painted my room black, and she had ripped down all the posters and was painting it back, and you know, typical story probably for most of us with, you know, parents reacting to what you're into.
Yeah, I still remember when I was around 15 years old, and something finally snapped in my mind, and I didn't paint, but I used some kind of cloth and all kinds of like black textures to get my room black, and I had bones and whatnot. I think it might have been a bit troubling to my dear parents at the time.
Yeah. Same with me. I ended up, I painted my whole room black, and they kind of let me get away with it for a while. And then my mom had, it was like right when I was getting into the black metal, like she kind of like caught on and lost her fucking shit basically and threw away all my shit and ripped all my posters down, and, you know. So, like I said, probably pretty common story for anyone into this kind of music.
I believe the reason why I asked you to recount this infamous devil is coming out of me experience was that I read from some interview of yours that these harrowing sleep paralysis type encounters came back with a vengeance when you were around 16 years old, and you had even a particularly disturbing, even ontological shock level harrowing out-of-body experience, which I reckon has largely influenced your later work with Akhlys. That was the part with you returned to the kitchen and then you saw some kind of entity. I just read it like a couple of weeks ago, and I thought that was quite disturbing even by my admittedly jaded standards.
Yeah, and again, I always like to, you know, for both sides, people on either side of the camps, I again want to just give all the information out there. Again, I was sick. So here's a common thread. I was sick. I had the flu. A precursor to that, I watched, it's funny because The Exorcist keeps tying into this, but I had watched with my good buddy Nick, the night before I had watched a documentary on The Exorcist. I think it was called like In the Grip of Evil. It was like on the true story of The Exorcist, right? So seeds are already sown in the mind, right? So anybody that wants to take a psychological bent on that, there you go. That's all true. I don't think it's so uncanny that I got sick after that. I think I just got sick. I'm not putting any emphasis on that. Stayed home. This is during the middle of the day. And these things started occurring, you know, like these things started occurring again. Just series of bad nightmares, series of, you know, sleep paralysis, to the point that, I mean, you know, I'm in the middle of my teens at this point, and I'm like sleeping in my parents' room, you know, like that's how fucked up I was over it. But anyhow, it culminated like the one day that, you know, that you had brought up was everyone's gone. My siblings were at school. My parents are at work. I'm in the bed, in my parents' bed. Just for some reason, that's the only place I felt safe. And, you know, day sleeping will do that. You know, you want to try and cultivate sleep paralysis, sleep during the day. And anyhow, it's like I'm going in and out of dreams. And I think most people can relate to this. If you have a bad dream and you don't sufficiently wake yourself up, you're probably going to slip back into it. You might. And that's kind of what was going on. But it was like out of body experience. Like felt like I was floating without a body out down my parents' hallway. And then if you take a right, you go into the kitchen. And this occurred exactly 3 times. And on the third, I had that feeling of dreadfulness and of presence on the first two. And then on the third, after allowing myself to fall back asleep after hardly really waking up, I was out in the kitchen again, and there was a figure on the other side of this little kind of kitchen island thing. And I remember there was a pot boiling. For some reason that stuck out. There was a pot, like someone's going to cook something, and this figure had its head down, like it was exhausted, like its arms, akimbo on the island, and its face buried in its arms. And all I could think of was that if this figure raised its head and looked at me, that I was done.
Yeah.
And it was like, not that I was going to die. I was going to die, but something worse than that was going to happen. And that's when I woke up with a shock. And that's when I decided, like, fuck this. I'm getting out of bed because I can't fall asleep and do this again. But yeah, so that was interesting. And then I walked out into the area, and what always stayed in my mind all these years was just the very particular nuances of even the lighting coming through the windows. And there's like a glass door that went out onto the deck, and like just the whole atmosphere was it was exact. That was this exact same atmosphere. I felt like I was now physically walking into my dream. Like there was no change in atmosphere or nuance whatsoever. And so that really shook me up, really scared the shit out of me. Actually, I got like a short spell of like agoraphobia after that. I didn't want to go outside. So
Yes.
Yeah, it was very, very strange and very pronounced. And, the irony is, I wish that these things occurred now in such a pronounced and unannounced way, but they rarely do in my older age.
Yeah, I just thought what we just hinted at. Now, given these even traumatic experiences with liminal dread, why didn't we shun these and get on with our lives like the so-called ordinary folk? Why did this nascent dread blossom into an ongoing obsession with the extremes of liminal, as it's easily evident with our art and craft? And I think this is a quite pertinent question, that are we some kind of like spiritual masochists?
Yeah, I was going to say it's very masochistic, right?
Yes.
I think the first term there, spiritual, I think for me, it served as some kind of evidence that there was something bigger going on in the world. And so at the time, I was definitely running away from it. I was like, fuck this. I don't want this to happen again. This is terrible. And I mean, at this point, I was already into death and black metal and shit, And it made me even question that. Like, I was like, maybe I'm fucking, maybe my mom's right. Maybe I'm fucking around with shit I should be fucking around with. You have that as a young person, you have that moment of hesitation. Like, what the fuck am I getting into? But I think I was intelligent enough to be like, it's not that simple. Like, it can't work that way. And I think really I became obsessed with it because it made me realize that there's something more that's going on. And at the time, it was like, okay, maybe this is a broader scope of the psychological, but even that would be interesting, right? Yeah. But I feel like the more I got into it, I started to realize I think it even runs beyond that. And so really that just led me into someone who at that point was raised Catholic, and probably around the same time I had my first experience, like, it wasn't really buying into that anymore. I feel like I was intelligent enough to be like, this is a little too fairy tale, like maybe entering into like an atheism.
Yeah.
An atheism, just it's Christianity or it's not. Like, those seem like the two options. It's either A or B. It's either Christ is the Son of God and we're going to heaven hanging out with our loved ones, or none of it exists. That was my world as a child, and I went with option B. I was like, this just, I'm not buying this. Into a broader context, through having what most people would say are horrible experiences they'd never want to occur again. And I'm like, I do want them to occur. I want them to occur more. How can I cultivate this? How can I chase this? Of course, with these kind of things, they have this uncanny nature of the more you forcefully try to chase them, the more they recede.
Yeah, they're playing a game of cats or something. And like you said, at an older age, you would want to experience these more, obviously, because you are better prepared, you are more experienced, you can handle them now. While as when you were a child, you didn't have the faculties to handle this kind of things, which is the same for me. And I would even believe that this kind of early childhood parasomniac experiences and with liminal actually cause some kind of trauma, which if you are lucky and resilient enough, you can kind of integrate that trauma into a kind of gnosis, to use as a fuel for your art and craft, like we have obviously done. I'm so obsessed about these topics that I sometimes feel like I'm the crazy scientist or like a researcher from out of a Lovecraft novel or something.
Oh,
And,
absolutely. Yeah. We're the madmen,
yeah, we are.
I'm okay with being the ranting and raving madmen on these subjects. But, one thing that interesting that did occur. So I'd say, there is a way to cultivate that, but it's the long way. And so when those things occurred to me, I do wonder sometimes if that was, again, my daemon speaking to me. But I also consider there's also, me and Richard Gavin talked about this, your own daemon. What's your own daemon and what's an autonomous daemon? That goes down another rabbit hole. But anyhow, so there are those considerations. Was this my own daemon? Was this something autonomous for myself? Was it? Not at all. Maybe it was neither. I had taken all possibilities. Was I just fucking sick on Robitussin? I don't think so, but perhaps. Anyhow, recently, I was going to say, so there is a way you can cultivate it, and I think that is through some sort of esoteric process and training or whatever you want to call it. That's how you cultivate it. And these things, and now this is no longer like the objective. It's an occurrence that happens as a result. And so you don't want to make this like your life's objective is to have parasomnia. These are just, again, signposts on a path that goes to something greater. So don't get distracted with these things when they occur. Analyze them. But most recently, this one was really fucking interesting. This is very recent. Is I was having a series of these kind of dreams. And in one of them, so they became very lucid and going in and out of dream and became very lucid. And one of them became so lucid that at one point I was inside of this kind of industrial type building. And I knew this entity was walking up the stairs, and then it kind of passed before me. And in my lucidity, I was like, I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to look at it. And I remember I couldn't, it just wasn't possible to look at it. And it appeared almost like a flickering shadow. Anyhow, that's not even the main thing I wanted to talk about. That progressed on. And then my next thought was, I know that I'm laying in bed. I know that I'm sleeping in this bed next to who was at the time my partner. And I decided I'm going to try and communicate with her. So I start describing in my dream, what I'm seeing. I'm like, I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to tell her, I'm going to try and actually vocalize in the real world and tell her what I'm saying. This is where my mind's going, right? So it's not quite rational, because you're still in the dream world. Well, and then she wakes me up. And she was like, you were just talking in your sleep. And I was like, what'd I say? I was so excited. I was like, what'd I say to you? What'd I say? I was trying to fucking, like an experiment. Like I was trying to tell you what I was saying in my dream. And she was like, you were just saying a bunch of jargon. She was like, it wasn't even English. You were just mumbling.
Yeah.
But I was still very excited about it because it kind of worked in a way. It's like, I'm going to talk to her from my dream. And I did in a way, And so that was pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And I think that, like you just said, that this phenomenon can coexist in psychological, more tactile, like a psychological, spiritual, esoteric, and liminal, whatever sides. They can be co-joined, and they don't take anything from each other. And I think being some kind of like amateur researcher of these things, I think it's really is a good idea to have like a multitude of viewpoints, than not just to go completely bonkers, with the liminal, because there is inherent dangers with that too. But something which I have been doing kind of like a collection of characteristics and anecdotes about this phenomenon. So one thing it came to my mind to ask you, because you are like a peer researcher of this phenomenon.
Sure.
Why do these sleep paralysis nightmares feel disturbingly more real than everyday life? What do you say?
Well, that's the uncanny nature, and we just have a tendency to compartmentalize these things because they do feel real, especially if you get to the point where you reach a state of lucidity, which is way more rare for me. But I've been trying to make it more of a focus, and so when you become fully lucid in dream, it feels like the vistas open up, and to a point that. Because everything's possible at that point, and you don't feel that in the day side. So it does start feeling like you're closer to the ground of reality. Oh. Paradoxically so. And and it gives me, I don't know, it makes me think of a lot of things. Quickly hearkening back to just what I was speaking about. I was thinking about this trying to communicate, and this might be just a totally romanticized idea, just a thought I had. But so that would be called glossolalia. So yes. Glossolalia is you see it in dream, but someone's dreaming and they're speaking, and sometimes they're just saying words, right? Like that's very normal too. Like you're actually speaking English or whatever your native tongue is. But then there's the glossolalia where there's some interesting studies that have been done on glossolalia, and glossolalia tends to have inflections and these other nuances that are characteristic to actual language. And you see this again with I think it's like the Pentecostals and certain denominations of Christianity, where they put an emphasis on speaking in tongues, which again is glossolalia. A lot of that, is probably totally bullshit, is probably psychodrama played out on the part of these individuals caught up in that psychodrama. But it made me think about it, and I was like, is there a possibility that this is a language in itself? And this is just total sidetrack thought that I've had, something that I just got interested in looking at. And then there's xenolalia, which is you see in the cases demonic possession, and xenolalia is when they start speaking actual languages that the person doesn't know.
Yes.
And there are cases of that, which is really interesting to see the psychoanalytical perspective on these ones they do feel might be valid. Feels like a stretch because they're like, okay, it's kind of the psychoanalytical approach to someone doing some kind of uncanny performance of strength. Then it's like they're like, well, you could reach this mind over matter state, and I'm like, well, can you just psychologically you can suddenly learn a language or have extra human strength or whatever. So it's just something that I've been lately ruminating on, is the glossolalia, in if we could call something a true instance of this, and if it does have the characteristics, if you had a linguist sit down and say, this has the characteristics of inflection and whatnot that we would find in an actual language, I just think it would be something that would be really interesting to analyze.
Yeah, I think I have read something about that subject from somewhere. And actually,
I kind of jokingly said, but also not jokingly, I was, I told her, I was like, that's the abyssal speech, And I said it as a joke, and then as I said it, I was like, actually, maybe it is.
It kind of clicked.
Yeah,
I understand. Another aspect of this phenomenon is that these liminal dream spaces, I mean, like the spaces where the dream is happening, are kind of, like you already said, pregnant with incorporeal entities. I remember Jung's early intense experience related to the channeling of Septem Sermones ad Mortuis, the seven sermons to the dead, back in 1916. He reported that his house was filled with the presence of spirits which he identified as the dead, and their arrival was sudden and overwhelming, filling the space around him with a palpable sense of their presence. What do you make of this aspect of these dreams? Maybe it's not the daimon aspect like behind the abyssal door, but it's the ambient presence of multitude of daimons.
Well, like like what I was saying before, like autonomous spirits.
Yes.
They are not projected from you; they are autonomous.
Yes.
Which, I mean, that's the idea of the daemon to begin with. Typically, besides your personal daemon. Yeah, I think that again, these things exist in their most potent forms in paradoxes. So that means an absence is at the same time a presence. And so that's, again, hard to articulate. And this is something I've talked about previously in interviews. Like, I talked about, I think in one instance with Aoratos, like my aunt and uncle's old barn, and walking into that barn, well, it's got a lot of absence. That absence itself, paradoxically, fills you with this sense of presence.
Yes.
And so that is that paradox. And I think that again is probably a hallmark of spirits or daemons. And it's the same. These archetypes, everyone understands, they just haven't thought about them. It's the same thing if anyone that thinks about going into a cellar. That's that absence that is at the same time uncannily a presence. And that's why you're like, ooh, I don't want to go down there. That emptiness. I don't like that emptiness. Why don't you like that emptiness? Because there's nothing there. Well, because there's nothing there that feels like there's something I don't understand. It's pregnant with it.
Yeah, I think it's in the DNA of the liminal, these paradoxes, like you just said.
Yes.
And while I'm recording this, I'm in an older, like a sauna cabin. This must be around at least 60 years old building. And I have two portable lights at the left and the right side of me. And I have a small makeshift altar to the right of me in this sofa. And there's this driftwood artifact made from wood, which resembles like some kind of demonic bird entity. And I have the mask of the pit behind that. And it's half submerged in the shadows. And it's in front of me, there's a window. And in Finland, we get some kind of darkness around midnight. And it's 11 p.m. at the moment. So it's getting darker as we speak. So it's quite fitting to get into the next subject, or rather, this is a perfect segue into a quite recent dream of mine, if you will. The podcast audience probably knows about the ritual haunts near my cottage, the pit. And there is a chthonic chapel in an abandoned ground cellar there, although its space is quite limited. We actually discussed this in your last episode. And nevertheless, it remains one of the most intensely powerful spots in the area. In the dream, however, I was cautiously trespassing on our neighbor's barren, rocky land and stumbled upon a slender, scarcely visible crevice in the rock. And in reality, we don't have that kind of terrain here. So it's in a dream world. And despite my height of 6 feet and of medium frame, I managed to squeeze through it. I was greeted by a cavernous chasm eerily akin to the claustrophobic confines of a submarine, narrow at 2 meters wide and elongated at 4 meters. The air in this threshold space was heavy with the aura of decades or even centuries of ritual use. It felt like the echoes were hanging in the air like a tangible presence. fascination mixed with an ominous sense of dread. In an instant, I recognized this space as an extension of the pit, a new hidden chapel for my most stark tonic rituals to come. And upon waking up, and after discussing this with my colleagues, including Richard Gavin, I remembered that he had alluded to the dead as some sort of ambient presence. And later, another guest on this podcast mentioned the concept of necromanteon, an ancient Greek temple of necromancy devoted to Hades and Persephone. Needless to say, I was since obsessed with finding, or rather excavating, this kind of new underground chapel at the pit, which I did some weeks ago. Actually, I have been excavating since, and the new temple should be completed by fall. So there you have it.
Yeah, that's excellent. And of course, as I had mentioned earlier, the any kind of excavation into the earth is going to be inherently connected with the dead. I mean, it always has been with the Greeks and otherwise perennial. You know, it's a perennial thought that is universal to cultures. And this is why the importance of the cave, you know, this is where that comes into play. Anything that goes into the earth. And why is that? Maybe, you know, perhaps the dead settle almost like a sediment into the earth. And that could also be a justification for the genus loci, that it settles into the sediment of a place. It fills that aura. So it exists upon the liminal cusp with, you know, one leg on one side, one leg on the other. That is the liminal, the in-between state. And then we look at the dead themselves, because this is always a good question. What is that? You know, is it truly the departed souls? And what is their function? And, you know, what is their capability? I always look to Gwinon on this one. I don't think that they're complete souls. I don't think that soul is maybe the right term. I think it's more like what you had said, a resonance. I think you referred to it as a shell. It's like a reverberation. And then we could look at stuff like the Egyptian thought on the dead, where the soul is kind of parsed out into elements. Like you could have like the Ba and the Ka. And one of those might be a lower, and this is what I probably believe it is probably a lower resonance. In most reported ghost sightings, they seem to have they seem to repeat the same actions. They seem to typically be unaware of the observer a lot of the times. Yes. Unless you get into like stuff like poltergeist, which that might be an entirely different category of something you're dealing with. To me, that sounds like something more demonic than something like a departed soul. But, you know, again, this is just all just speculation on my part. I really have no fucking clue. But anyhow, back to what we were talking about. Like, yeah, I think that's why it was important in these cultures to have these underground abodes, because you are connecting through a like phonic aspect into whatever you want to call the ancestral dead. And so I think that, you know, there's that downward movement again. That's the connotation. And so I think that we see this in dreams. I've had a lot of dreams where it takes place in subterranean areas. I've had a couple dreams of what I termed hell, that were absolutely subterranean. And then again, we can go back to psychology and be like, well, these are things that were already put into your mind. I get that. You know, I was raised Roman Catholic, and so I get that aspect. But even on a purely esoteric level, I think what you're doing, have like, if you can or like create a subterranean ritual space, I think that's going to serve you. I think that's a very idealistic area to perform any kind of rites or meditation.
Yes, I visited the place last night actually, and I'm kind of at the halfway of digging the bottom for the temple. And it was interesting that even though I was completely alone, I felt like I wasn't alone. And this is something which almost always happens in the pit at night. And it took me some years to even understand that this has been happening all along, this effect. And I find it at the same time quite soothing, like a psychological device. And sometimes it's also quite eerie and even uncanny because like it depends on the atmosphere of the pit. And I sometimes even liken that during some kind of rituals at the pit, it feels it has its own even like a microclimate, if you catch my drift, you know.
Sure. Well, again, you're cultivating that with the dread married to fascination.
Yeah.
There is that, and I think maybe that's the delineating factor between people that are like us and people that are not. Is maybe certain people have the dread but not the fascination, whereas people like us, it's just hand in hand. How can you not be fascinated by that? And so you're going to want to delve further into it. And all these things, like with, again, back to like the symbol of the cave, we're talking about phonic symbols, which is what sublunar. And how more chthonic can you get than digging into the earth?
Yes.
How more occulted can you get than digging into the earth? That is the downwards, like the literal downwards. And this is the same thing that I was thinking of when I did the cellar. The symbol of the cellar. I was like, okay, so two things are going on in the element at all times. So with the cellar, it's like you have the underworld and the cellar. So you've got two images on one coin. One's maybe presented more dayside, like the cellar. It's like, that's why I'm trying to reach out to the listener and be like, the cellar. If you've been in a cellar, then you get it. And it's like, here's the spiritual archetype of that is the underworld. And making that connection, Yeah, I think that's great, man. I'd fucking love to come out and see that area because from the pictures you've shared, it looks incredible.
Thanks. Next time you're in Finland, just hit me up so I can arrange proper pit catabasis. The main rite of the pit is called catabasis, and I have held for a small group of people, like at least 4 of those during the last 4 years now. These liminal spaces, for example, the pit, which I have used like countless hours of digging, manual labor, which I think is very important, like sacrifice, It's interesting how they are volatile in the sense at times that suddenly the atmosphere can turn into quite freezing during even like a summer nights or out.
Well, yeah, I mean, even the digging itself, I mean, that's like a ritual process. You're basically digging your own grave because you're going there to essentially die,
Yeah.
And so you are digging your own grave. And that catabasis through, again, using a Jungian term here, an androdromia through extremes can lead to an anabasis, the opposite.
Yes.
And again, it's thrown from once you reach that tension, the extreme of that tension from the digging your own grave into the abyss, that once you hit that apex of that, which is a paradoxical term because, but then you are thrown into the celestial, into the nadir point. And this is where I think like symbols like the pole star or the the pillar of the world comes into play. So you have two Axis Mundi. Yes, exactly. That's the term I was looking for. And then you have Draco, and you have, there was Eastern thought that Ahriman, was born in the celestial north, in the basically the black abyss of the cosmos, at the celestial north. And so I like that idea. And so you have a reflection again, between above and below. And now this falls outside of, because we have a tendency to fall, as Westerners, fall into a Christian context. Like above is, when I say celestial, people will think of heaven. It's like, no, that's not at all what I'm talking about.
Yes, is it related to as above, so below?
Somehow. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep. It's the expanse versus the confined, the chthonic, the sublunar.
Yeah, I think this is one note which I had for this interview, which was actually in your interview with Bardo Methodology, which I used their interviews to kind of excavate interesting talking points. There was a reference to Dr. Skitz from Morbid. He said that contemporary Western society is the only culture anywhere in the world at any time that neither believes in spirits nor has ways of relating to them. Now, I'm not taking a stance whether these spirits are incorporeal entities or something to do with how we are experiencing psychic reality behind the straitjacket of so-called consensus reality, maybe even akin to Patrick Harpur's Daimonic Reality, the book. The question is still very pertinent.
Yeah, no, I say that's very, very true. And it's unfortunate because we've kind of cut the umbilicus, to the spiritual in the modern mindset, because none of this exists, or it exists in a way that's so obtuse and just viewed through the lens of maybe the psychological, that it's lost its potency. And maybe that's why we're such a fucking mess. It's also anybody that puts any stock into the Kali Yuga. It's a sign. It's probably one of the biggest signs of the Kali Yuga is that loss of true spirituality. And then what are you left with? You're just material means. Very nihilistic. Very nihilistic. Then there is no meaning. And that is where the true nihilism starts, is you cut off the idea of spirituality, and then you're left with just gross materiality, and then it's just a downward spiral from there, because then nothing has any meaning. Even stuff like virtue, morals, it's all becomes so subjective to the point of being diluted water that it's pointless.
Yeah, it's like mainlining void or something, like akin to doing fentanyl or whatever. It's like it doesn't end well for anybody.
No, and it's not going to end well. But it's also, that's part of the cycle. At least I believe. It's organic. Yeah. It's like anything else that we can observe with our eyes. It decays, and that is what it is.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea for some people who are I don't think there are many in my audience who are not like who wouldn't understand even what we are talking about, but say like some kind of invented materialistic hardline atheist, materialist, skeptic, whatever, would think that all this talk about Mysterium Tremendum and these diamonds, it's like a complete nonsense, because it doesn't have any kind of material which you can grasp on. I would say that in the safe space of consensus reality, it's easy to brag and to be like a tough guy when you are surrounded by some kind of like a henchman, And if somebody would take this henchman, which I'm referring to consensus reality with, in front of this invented character, he would totally sit his pants if he would be encountering some kind of true numinous or true liminal without help from his bodies.
Sure. Well, and I'd also say that, the people that take the empirical scientific view that these things, everything we've talked about are flights of fancy, the You can overturn that quickly by saying, well, then based on your definitions, the consciousness itself is a flight of fancy based on your definitions, because the consciousness has not been explained by science and cannot be explained by science. No matter we can get down to in erotic situations, they could be like, these are the chemicals that are released in the brain, right?
Yeah.
We can see the mapping of the brain. Same with fear responses, same with everything. What they haven't been able to delve into is consciousness itself. Why? How? Yeah. Why and how? So if someone wants to take that gross approach of casting all these things that they feel are ephemeral, like you said, you cannot grasp onto, we cannot deduce it categorically, then consciousness is right there. Then that's another ghost they have to dispel. And that's problematic because that's themselves. That's our point of which we observe the world and digest everything. That's who we actually are, is our consciousness. The ground of consciousness they cannot explain scientifically. And so if you're going to cast out all these other things, you have to cast out that, and you have to cast out yourself, and then you reach the 0 point where it's like, it's not doable. Yeah. If you're going to argue it with that fervor, argue it all the way. And you can't.
And it's like, if you're going to be skeptical about your skepticism. Yeah, like you said, go all the way, with this.
Well, what they usually fall back on is like, we'll eventually figure it out.
Yeah, and it's I can add a bit more fuel to the fire. I just saw this huge image or map of the known universe, and based on the most current astronomical findings, and it was just fucking mind-boggling. And there is this concept of dark matter, and what fucking not in the world of astronomy. And it's like then some fucking piss ants over here in the earth are saying that everything is now ready, the knowledge is complete, and it's never complete.
It can't be complete, and that's the issue. And so if we're going to look at astronomy, right?
Yeah.
Even if we look at what science knows now, hard science knows about the universe and the expanding of the universe. You always people like us go right to, well, what's beyond that?
Yeah.
What is it expanding into? What is it expanding into? Well, we don't have the answer for that one yet.
Yeah.
And once you do have the answer for that one, there'll be another thing that you don't have the answer for. I mean, it's just, it's limitless. It's limitless. And for something to be limitless, then there has to be a bigger puzzle. And it's like, I'm not denying science. Like, science is a part of the puzzle. It plays by its own playing field. It does not analyze or look at things outside of it. And there are things outside of it.
Definitely. I don't also think that science is any kind of problem. The problem is scientism and the people who adhere to scientism as some secular religion. I think those people are the problem. But then again, that doesn't have too much to do with science.
Well, anymore. And again, it's a religion of nihilism. Guénon made a great point on this. It's his whole thing is the qualitative versus the quantitative.
Yeah.
It does away with all the qualitative. There is no qualitative. There's only quantitative. A meaningless universe. That's what it is. And then, the reaction towards that is people are like, well, maybe that is, and you just can't deal with it. So you have to give it meaning. But then, we can fall back on the things that we just talked about, and I was like, well, science does have a limit. It does have a limit. And even when we go into psychology, you look at someone like Jung, and I'm like, man, this guy was tiptoeing right around esotericism. Yeah. And you look at the Red Book, and I'm like, I don't think he was tiptoeing anymore. I think he was sticking his feet in fully. And some of the stuff that he talks about is, you brought this up earlier, his house being haunted.
Yes.
I think that we just don't fully understand the language of Jung. I think that's probably a more correct answer to it. I think Peter Kingsley is striking at that in Cataflac. That's exactly what he's talking about. No, he did understand. You guys didn't understand.
Yes. Yeah, Peter Kingsley is a very interesting character. We discussed earlier, I think his earlier book, Dark Places of Wisdom, and I finally got it about a year ago from my friend, and he was a true find.
Yeah, that's a quick and very potent read, and and Kingsley is such a great example on the topic we're discussing, because his first book, which the name is, I can't think of the name now, but his first book got so much praise because it was done academically.
Yes.
Right. And it's very Platonic. And then he made all these claims, right? He made all these claims that basically got him cast out of the academic world, because his claims are pretty wild. He got sick for a while, and he claims that he basically had conversation with Parmenides, and started making all these claims about like the cult of Asclepius, and quickly was shunned as you start making these claims, and that's what will happen. And then they started justifying some of his claims through excavations. And so it's just uncanny, because it's like, well, here's this guy that said that he got really sick for a long time, and had these dialogues with these pre-Socratic figures, and made these claims, and then these claims ended up being true, which was discovered later through excavations. And so, these things should not be taken with a grain of salt.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good one, man. I'd like to hear your thoughts on Dark Places of Wisdom. Is a great fucking read. That's something I recommend to people anytime someone's like, hey, could you recommend me esoteric books? I'm like, read Dark Places of Wisdom. It's quick. It's potent. If you're not into that, then give up on the whole fucking thing. Go somewhere else.
Yeah. I remember that there was this criticism that while Kingsley was an accomplished academist, somebody said that he turned mad mystic or something, and he once I think he once said that you got it all wrong. I was a mystic before turning into an academic scholar, and that the academic scholarship was like a part of my mystic path of being a mystic, and I find that very exhilarating, like a comeback.
No, that was a perfect retort to that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they were, the academics at the time were very disappointed, because he released a book that they found so much value in.
Yeah.
And then he took a left turn, and they were like, oh, fuck this guy.
Yeah. It's like that in consensus reality. Actually, I think we are right at the end of this episode, but I had one thing has been pestering me since the last episode, because you hinted something about the archetypal trickster's mask, or to be more exact, what is behind it. What you said, and it really brought cold shivers to me. So can you rehash and even expand a bit? What did you think was behind the grin of the trickster, his mask, if you remember this part?
I mean, truthfully, I actually gave this away in Melano. Behind which is no thing.
Yeah.
Naas of the void, form changer. Those are the lyrics. And so what's behind that mask is no thing, is nothing.
Yes.
But the nothing is, again, that grand paradox that is the ground of reality. That's what's behind the mask of a god, is nothing. And that nothing, and that's, that sounds very melodramatic, right?
Yeah.
But the ground of nothing, for something to be everything, it has to be nothing at the same time. That's the paradox. And you see this again in concepts in the East, like nirvana. Nirvana is one with the void. And then in Platonism, the absolute, the great good, cannot have any adornment, none. Can't have a name. It has to be absolutely limitless. That is at one time everything and nothing at once. And so again, it sounds melodramatic, but that's what it is. And that's what ego death is. So when you read about ego death, it's the destruction of the ego where you become one with everything, and that's nothing at the same time. That is one with the void. David Hyam Smith is another great author to look at when you want to really dissect this concept, coming from a stance of kind of Lurianic Kabbalah, but divorced from the orthodoxy of Judaism. But anyhow, yeah, that's what it is. And so behind that mask, that's the uncanny paradox. You remove that mask, it's nothing. It's no thing.
Yes, I fucking get it. It's like when you speak about this, I see the silhouette, or rather the form of somebody's face or something which should be where the face is, but there is this void and it's completely pitch black, and then there's like dim stars like shining through it. So it's totally
Yes.
the other.
Yes. And so that same nothing is a precursor to everything.
Yes.
Because it's full and pregnant with all potentiality. Everything rises from it. Everything. So at the same time, it's nothing and it's everything. But at its core, it is literally nothing.
Yes. I think this is the perfect way to end this episode. Thank you very much, Naas, for joining us today. This has been Mycelium Signal podcast. Stay tuned for a visionary epiphany based on the track of Maze of Phobetor from our collective, The Netherworld Gate, Tuonen Portti. Good night.
The heavens darken, veiling the light in their oppressive shroud. None can discern the origin of the spirit-crushing reverberations, for naught is visible, save the encroaching gloom. Is this the march of an ancient barbarian horde, or some ghastly phantasm from a yet unwritten future? Beyond the clouds, a vessel lingers, its curiosity piqued, having unleashed a plague of insects, the likes of which have not been seen since the days of Egypt's resplendent glory. Terror seizes all beings, with no refuge to be found. The relentless barrage commences, and at last a semblance of peace descends beneath the watchful gaze of the beings. Yet the tempest of wrath remains unfulfilled. Phobetor decrees the annihilation of souls, their spectral forms floundering in the liminal abyss, desperately clinging to existence. The atmosphere becomes charged with an electric dread as the conflict transitions to the other worlds. The ancient armored hornets, emissaries of relentless destruction, burn the essence from the souls with their incandescent scarlet eyes, leaving none to escape this dire fate.